Hello and welcome to this video on the Samples 2 from SoundForce, a massively flexible but small and simple multi-channel sample player in only 4 HP. Here's what's to come. This video is sponsored by SoundForce, and I'll start with just saying where this comes from, and this comes from the original 4 HP samples module, which was a 6-channel basic sample player with preloaded 808 drum sounds. I really like the module for just adding classic sounds to a modular system, and I made a video which I'll link below when it was released. SoundForce then released other non-808 variants like the 707, and there's a Linn drum and 909 down here, and these are still available and are half the price of the Samples 2 if you'd like to get those and add those classic drum sounds to your system. The new Samples 2 builds on this and is a 5-channel sample player with multiple playback modes across 5 mono channels or up to 2 stereo channels and 1 mono channel with onboard mixing. Everything is set up and plays back from a USB drive, so you can create folders of your own samples and move through them and their settings with the click of the single button on the module. With each folder of samples, you have a settings text file, which allows you to create a stereo pair from channels 1 and 2, or from channels 3 and 4. You can turn on and off a loading beep sound, which can be handy, set playback modes individually for all 5 channels, and you can turn on playback speed modulation for channel 1 using channel 2's input, and you can do that for channel 3 using channel 4's input as well. And I'll add that the manual lays all of this setup out really nicely. It's easy to configure with basic word changes in this text file. There's an impressively low 0.15 milliseconds latency, the ability to play back long stereo files, 44.1 kHz and 16-bit audio playback, and onboard file conversion for sub 30-second files, though you can play back much longer files too, and all of which adds a lot of depth and capability to such a simple module. And finally, I'd opened up this video to my Patreon supporters to get them involved, and some of them sent in audio files for me to use and play with. So you'll see some no-talking musical interludes through the video, and their names are credited on screen. Thanks to those that sent in audio, and if you'd like to be part of this sort of thing in the future, head to patreon.com/DivKid and join in. The timing index is on screen, skip around as you like. Let's dive in. So here's the folder Shaker from SoundForce, featuring this nice dynamic round robin of shaker sounds. And it's just a trigger in here, but as it's cycling through these different but similar shaker samples, it's incredibly musical, varying, kind of organic shaker sound. I have a couple of hi-hats here panning around with LFOs modulating my mixer, kick and snare. And this is very electronic, very static sounding, with a round robin of shakers added to it. It's incredible life to add to that beat just by varying the sample. I then have the UDCO and VCF VCA6 here, breaking all these sounds out into the mixer along with this simple bass sound, just having some fun. In this example, I want to look at working with melodic sequences. And there's three things here that I'd like to cover. The first is playing back notes in order, actually playing back a sequence, and then carving into that musically and rhythmically. The second is playing it back randomly. And the third is the idea of baking in, kind of working into your samples, probabilities. On channel 2 and channel 1 here, I have exactly the same pattern, the same audio, the same pattern of notes in the same order on the USB drive there. But I've set channel 2 to be a multi-sample linear, so it will just play back through in order. And I'm triggering here with a steady clock. I have some effects set up as well. And you can hear this just cycles through the sequence exactly as I've set it on the USB drive. If I move to a steady clock pattern with 75% probability on every step, so it now won't play all the time, you can see that on the scope, and you can hear the result. And instead of using clocks at all, you could simply use a pattern. This is a steady pattern here on this channel. And because there's 16 audio files to make this 16-step sequence, and there isn't 16 steps here, we're going to get overlap across the bars, which is going to result in a more interesting pattern. If I actually trigger channel 1, this is just set to multi-sample, so this will play back randomly. And while this is triggering the notes randomly on channel 1, we can still add the probability of the gates firing. So we've really kind of carved up this 16-step pattern with playing different notes, because each note's a different audio file randomly here. I'm not always firing them in time. And you could use that set rhythm again. Now on channel 3, this is set to multi-sample, random, not the linear version, just multi-sample. And I've baked in the idea of probabilities for what pitches, what notes will actually play. And I have the notes here C, G and A flat, and if I just put those three notes on, they'd all have a 33.3 recurring % chance of firing, because it will randomly fire through those three samples. But I've added that C, the lowest note here, 3 times, so there's a 60% chance that the note C will fire, 20% chance the note G will fire, and a 20% chance the A flat will fire. So with a little bit of planning, you can bake in probabilities into the multi-sample playback there. And I can see me really using this for melodies and patterns, certainly with sounds like this that are already complete, to complement the rest of the modular system, not just using it for drums. So here we're looking at 3 different ways to beat juggle. I'm using a kick and snare sample on channels 1 and 2 here. Let's remove those from the mix. And here's the output of channel 5, a mix of 3, 4 and 5. I'm going to use them one at once, coming through a filter. And I've zoomed out so you can see the sequencing and how we're going to look at the idea of this beat juggling. So I've set up this sample set here on the USB drive. So on channel 3, I have the full breakbeat. It's 2 bars at 130 BPM. I've set my sequencer to work with this tempo. So a simple trigger at the start of the sequence plays this in time. This is the rewind mode, normal playback, just plays to the end and then restarts on a new trigger. Adding in my kick and snare, just in a mixer up here. The complementary kick and snare just play over this break perfectly fine. Now muting these again. If I move down to this pattern, I have the same trigger at the start, but then much lower probability triggers to reset and kind of juggle that break on channel 3. So every time this plays, it resets. Bringing these back in. If I don't have these in, again, this just triggers that loop, or rather that 2-bar break, and plays in time. We have an interesting re-juggling of this break by resetting it. Moving to channel 4 here, I've prepared this as a multi-sample, but it's a multi-sample linear mode, meaning it'll play through in order rather than randomly. So sending in a clock for each chunk of sample here, typical just chopping up the breaks in a DAW, I'm addressing this, playing through linearly against my kick and snare. And what's quite nice there is, if I go to the next pattern that has probabilities that these won't always fire, we're going to move through in order, but not playing totally kind of on the clock. So the beat is playing each chunk linearly, but it's not playing every clock pulse there, resulting in skips in the pattern. Becomes more obvious with this kick and snare in. And going back up to the pattern above here that's playing like a clock all the time, moving down to channel 5, this is set to be multi-sample. It'll just play randomly. Kick and snare back in on my mixer. And finally, swapping down to this probability based pattern. Again, just listening to this solo. There's a probability this won't always fire, so it doesn't always fire a chunk of this breakbeat. And the multi-sample mode there just randomly moves through them as well. Kick and snare back in. So having just looked at 3 different ways to juggle breakbeats, let's look at 4 different ways to flip samples, i.e. play with non-beat based samples here. And the first 3 are the same as how we just juggled and sliced up and shuffled around the breakbeat. I have some drums, kick and clap from the top 2 channels, and the hi-hat here from the original samples module. And then the output of 5 is what we're listening to through this filter, in some effects in the background. And on channel 3 I have a 90 BPM guitar loop. It's already stretched, granularized and played with, but I know it's at 90 BPM, so I've set my sequencer to work with a single trigger at the start of the bar here that just starts the playback in rewind mode and just resets every time that trigger comes round. Now, as we did with the breakbeat, going down to the next channel, I have a definite trigger that fires at the start of every bar, but some lower probability triggers here that will reset this playback. And it's a fun way to repeat and play with that sample. Now here's a set of triggers on every step, and let's patch this into channel 4, which is set to multi-sample linear. So I've chopped this into chunks, and each chunk will play with the sequencer in order. Now if I move down to the next channel, the probabilities, I'm not sure you can see it on that screen, are lower, so they won't fire all the time, so we'll skip some of the samples. But as it's multi-sample linear, it will still play through them in order. And you can see some of these are skipping, it's not that steady clock anymore. And then the third way, just as we did with the breakbeat, is to use channel 5 here, which I've set to multi-sample. Let's send in a steady clock. Every single clock playing now, every step in the sequence. And unlike the multi-sample linear, this will play randomly through the multi-samples. And I like random. Certainly works really well against the beat. And just to send that into the lower probability steps here. But I have an additional way that you could play with this in more of a, say, MPC-like fashion, and just give me a moment to repatch. So here's a more kind of MPC approach or sample per pad style approach, where I've taken these chunks of the audio that I'd cut up, and rather than using multi-sample mode, I've used rewind mode just to play that single sample on each of the 5 channels. Now going through these individually, this is the trigger for the sample we're currently listening to. It's coming through the time machine delay here, so because we're using separate outs we can treat them all differently, which is a nice thing to do in modular. Orange cables and second channel here, just a different cut of the sample there, panned slightly right. Yellow cables, channel 3. Again, different sample there. Channel 4, green cables. On these 2 steps here and coming into a big reverb. And channel 5, purple cables. That's playing on every single step, first coming through my filter. And then there's some panning like an auto pan on the mixer itself. Just a different approach to chopping up samples and playing them back and making the most of it in a modular system. Here we're looking at the rewind fade mode. The default is the rewind mode, which the top 4 channels are in, with a kick, snare, percussion and hi-hat sample coming into my mixer with some effects on them. And the rewind mode triggers the sound, plays all the way through to the end of the sound, and then when a new trigger is received, resets and plays back through from the beginning. However, the 5th channel is in rewind fade mode. That's just set on the settings text file for this folder of samples. And that responds to gate length. It plays for the duration that the gate length or the trigger is high, and then as that trigger or gate falls in voltage, it will then fade back out. This has been tailored to hi-hat sounds. So here I have a 909 style hi-hat sound with varying gate lengths coming in on this trigger pattern. I'll overlay an image here of the gate length from my sequencer. This is just short triggers. And you can see on the scope, these aren't varying. Just a short trigger just clocking around repetitively. If I move to a sequence, those bars rising up and down on the image from my sequencer is actually the gate length per step. Let's put the rest of the drums back in. Let's take a look at playback speed and how you can change the pitch and playback speed of your samples. Red cables here, channel 5 is a kick drum, simple trigger in, sound coming out into my mixer. Channel 3, orange cables, is a snare drum, and in the settings file on channel 3 I've enabled playback speed modulation, and that uses channel 4's trigger to modulate the speed of channel 3. If channel 3 was stereo, you could output stereo on 3 and 4. As it's mono, I'm just coming out of 3 here. We now don't get anything out of 4 because we're going to use its trigger to modulate playback speed, therefore pitch. Now if I patch in a simple square wave LFO here, this is patched into the scope, we can see it's around 105 Hz. And a 100 Hz trigger will play the speed back at the original speed. As I turn up the rate of this LFO, you could equally use a VCO. We start to pitch up. So again, a 100 Hz trigger is what this needs to play back at the speed of the sample. Going higher, we'll go higher in pitch. Going lower, slower playback speed and lower pitch. Now I like leaving this tuned down, and what's quite nice on the module is you can unplug the trigger and it remembers that playback speed. So if I was to tune up the snare and unplug it, it just remains where it was. And then on the top channel, let's even remove this, have this percussion sound, and equally we can use a trigger, square wave LFO here, faster than 100 Hz speeds up, slower than 100 Hertz. Plays back at lower pitches. So if you use an LFO that actually has some modulation on it, here's a CV sequence from my sequencer. And because I'm modulating the rate of this LFO, I'm modulating the rate of the pitch. Snare back in, that's been left pitched lower down. Kick, extra sounds. So I had an idea to turn the samples into a stereo wavetable oscillator. I started on the computer with the software Serum from Extra Records and made a kind of wide stereo, heavily distorted, characterful drone. I've set the playback speed to be set up so that I can use channel 2 to modulate the speed of channel 1, and as I've set this to stereo, I get the left and right out of the first and second outputs. But let's actually plug in a trigger, and we're going to use the dual LFO here, square wave, and the frequency you can see here on Data's tuner. I'm nearly at 100 Hertz. 100 Hertz will play back at normal playback speed. And as I reduce it, oh yeah. I love this pitching down. But for actually playing pitches into it, as I'm doing here, I'm triggering from the keyboard overlaid on screen, and I have the pitch from the keyboard coming in to the DCO here, and I'm using this tuned close to 100 Hertz as I can get it. So this is normal playback, and I know that my file is the note C. If I play an octave higher, I go up an octave, octave lower, down an octave, and I can trigger this from a keyboard, play my pitch into another oscillator, and use that oscillator square to do the pitch tracking here on the samples. Now this is coming through some filtering that's been modulated by envelopes. So this is an auto scanning wavetable in that it's just playing back through the file all the time there. You could set this up to toggle and start to build up a loop if you like, to just have this looping through the wavetable that you've created, or have a WAV file that we're just playing through like a wavetable. It's really interesting use of the samples too. Give it a go. So in this example, we're going to go through two different things. Going through setting up different mix levels in the attenuation mode for the channels here, and also looking at the toggled on and off behavior. Now to get into the attenuation mode, where we'll start here, we're going to mute all the triggers because it's the thing that we're triggering that we'll be affecting here. So I'm going to mute them on my sequencer, and channel 2 here, one layer of this clap, it's just slightly too loud, and we enter the attenuation mode holding the button for a second. Get the beep to tell us that we're in that mode. And then as I press this button, it cycles through levels of attenuation. And I'll press through quite fast, go back round to the full volume, and then set it where we'd like it. So let's try 2 clicks down from where we were, muting that trigger in my mixer, and then unmuting the trigger for channel 5. Let's just try a couple of clicks, just to take the edge off those hi-hats. I'll hold this button to come back out of that attenuation mode. This is now saved in the settings files. And you can hear that we've set up a different mix. Now muting the mix here, The yellow cables, channel 4, is being taken out of the mix by patching its output, and that's triggering on, off, on, off, on, off. And if I unpatch that trigger while it's on, this is just one long ambient recording. So as I trigger this again, on, off, running this into the filter, and some reverb, setting that against the beat. So believe it or not, what we're currently listening to is a kick drum. And I'm audio rate triggering samples here for a new way to oscillate. So here's the mix out directly into my mixer here, and I'm triggering an 808 kick from the sub out on the UDCO. It's just any standard oscillator or say square wave LFO would work here. And by tuning this up to audio rates, we get some really interesting sounding waveforms. Now this is a bit like two oscillators where you're patching with hard sync. This pitch isn't changing, the sound of the 808 kick is static, I'm not doing anything to it, but I'm re-triggering it with a changing pitch as I change the tuning here. We can do this with the snare sample I have on free. And I like snares because you get all this noisy top end that's then good for filtering. So for now, sticking with the kick, and patching in a volt proctive sequence to my oscillator that's triggering it, we get the effect. It's almost like pitch tracking. One thing to note, this could be 5 channels, 5 notes of polyphony. I have the same kick drum on channel 2 here. If I patch in, say, a higher octave output from this oscillator, we can really start to build up some interesting and unique tones. I could trigger channel 2 from, say, just an LFO. Just try and get them into some nice tuning here. So this is just static, triggered by the LFO, tuned high. This is being pitch modulated. Now of course we can patch back through the filter here and start to modulate and articulate these notes. You could use VCAs as well to now close down this sound. But let's actually try changing the pitch of the sound, which I've set up here on channel 3. I'm going to trigger this statically. So from an oscillator that's now not modulated, but I've set up playback speed modulation. So if I patch in, say, the higher saw wave there, it's 2 octaves higher than the sub. So I'm using the sub octave to trigger it, the saw wave above it to modulate it. And if we look at the playback speed section of this video, you know it takes triggers to adjust playback speed and therefore pitch. We now have a sample whose pitch is changing relative to how fast it's being triggered. So putting the sequence back in, and we could trigger statically. Let's trigger playback speed from the LFO. Oh yeah, I'm here for this. Oh, it's like some really gritty old digital wavetable tech or something. almost formant vocal sounding. And again, all of this through a filter, VCAs, low pass gates. Treat this as like your weird sample polyphonic oscillator. If you've got this far in the video, go drop a hard sync in the comments. What an impressive little module. This one that I can see me using in nearly everything with how much I've managed to get out of it, reaching way beyond basic triggered drum sounds. Head over to patreon.com/DivKid to support the work that I do, gaining access to exclusives over there. Hit like and subscribe, it all helps out the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye!